Camila Falcha. Welcome to Irish Granny Tarot. It's time for our Saturday book, and we're concluding today Escaping from Eden by Paul Wallis. I was overwhelmed by the positive feedback I got about this book, and as a result, I ordered a couple of his other books, and I'm going to cover them as we go down the queue. I wanted to thank people who've donated to the book fund, and when we do the next video here in relationship to this book, I will possibly read cards on it and also do the book drawing for the free book. And I'll let you guys decide. I'll give you a couple of choices. Whoever wins, you can get in touch with me at irishgrannytarot@gmail.com, and we'll negotiate which book you've won. In the meantime, let's go ahead and finish this. This will be video number 3 of Escaping from Eden. And we had just finished chapter 6, so now we're on chapter 7, The Memory of Us. So, probably help if I put on my glasses. So, the only losers, he says, when we ignore information that has come down from us, from our ancestors, it's just to our detriment to ignore this. And we have done that. We have been pretty consistently dismissive, at least in American culture, Western culture. I think other cultures, it's a different situation. But we're kind of dismissive of anything that smacks of mythology or lore or ancient history or fairy tales. Just ask Jacques Vallée. We tend to consider it primitive thinking or superstitious thinking or completely erroneous because they don't have enough science under their belt. And we equate myth and ancient texts with fiction, or we look at them as allegorical, as moral tales like Aesop's fables. But some religions, some cultures do the opposite, and they consider all of this stuff divinely inspired and 100% true, but they go to the opposite extreme and they don't question. They take it on face value. So you have people who are very materialist, sort of a scientific bent, that kind of worldview, dismiss all of it as superstition, primitive nonsense. Like my friend, the bookseller here in town, who made fun of me for reading Zecharia Sitchin. But then you've got people on the other end who are very devout whatevers, and they consider their religious texts to be the Word of God, not to be questioned, not to be challenged, taken literally. So these two things are obviously, polar opposites. And Paul Wallis says that he sees many parallels between most important ancient texts from all cultures in all religions. I like to say you take a Venn diagram, those circles, and you put all sorts of features and facts about each religion in the circle, and where they intersect, the circles intersect. And if you do that for all religions, you end up with what looks like the petals of a flower with the center where they all overlap and they share commonality. And this is what he discovered when he made the huge mistake of playing ultimate frisbee and broke his leg. So he says this all begs the question, there's so much similarity in sort of the skeleton of all of these schools of thought. Are we looking at our own history? Are these ancient memories? Are we really looking at facts that have been clouded by the distance? Oh, and then in what do you call it here? I wrote, I'm not saying that this is fact. I'm saying that this next part is his word. I just want to make it very clear for the algorithms that I'm not advocating anything as true or not true. I'm simply saying what comes out of this book. So according to Paul Wallis, all of these religions say that humans emerged through interaction with higher intelligences, and that our evolution happened with assistance. And the Darwinian notion of it happening over time in stages very well may be true, but it also may be true that it didn't start out that way. Now, this is his theory. Okay, and moving on. The Popul Vuh and the Sumerians, their texts, these agree that male slaves made the first modification. Male slaves were the original hybridization from entities, and they were like the prototype. And then they needed females because, gee, they didn't think about that. And then it evolved from there. And humanity's progress often creates angst in the superior beings, according to these stories, which is contradictory because they're supposed to be superior beings. They're supposed to be divine in most of these resources, these old texts. And the assumption, I guess, is that if you're divine, you don't suffer the same kind of angst that humans do. That's one of the contradictions, you know. Why is God always so angry? So the meeting of the superior beings in the Popul Vuh and the council in Genesis sound the same. They even speak in almost exactly the same sentences, and it's hard for us to, it's easy for us to forget that this is pre-internet. This is pre-international travel. These people were completely isolated from each other, and in several cases didn't know of the existence of each other. And yet their ancient texts are almost word for word the same in some places. For example, when they say, now, speaking of humans, now they have become one, like one of us. So other cultures too reflect this similarity. We haven't talked as much about them. In Nigeria, there's the Ethic people. I hope I said that right. And in the beginning, they believed humanity was more childlike. We were like children. And the sky beings took care of us in a patriarchal kind of way. And that humans were, that there was an original couple, male and female, and that they eventually felt ready over time to emerge from the supervision and care of the sky beings. And the male sky being, who was called Abasi, he feared that humans would deliver his own level of wisdom. So here's a sky being, superior, right? A god, a divinity, who's afraid of people getting too smart, getting too wise. And he tells his wife, Atai, that he doesn't want these people, these humans, to become like one of us. And so the compromise was reached that that the gods, would stay on Earth in the daytime, but sky beings at night would go up to the sky to eat and rest and get away from these pesky humans. And they were forbidden to marry. They were forbidden to have children, so that they wouldn't, they also weren't allowed to hunt and farm. They didn't want them to increase in wisdom or increase in strength or become a challenge to the sky beings. This is a common thread through all these cultures. But the human woman got sick of being treated like a child. Of course it was the woman. And she refused to go and be monitored by the sky beings in the evening and everything. And so she stayed away from them. And the man was hanging out with the sky beings. And the next thing they know, the man and the sky beings find the woman farming and doing all these new technologies of the time. And this impresses the man. He's like, whoa, look what you can do. And he's impressed with her wisdom and with her independence, and he falls in love with her. And he doesn't return to deal with the sky beings, and this couple become great people. So we've got very similar to the story of Adam and Eve, where the woman is the one who dives into sources of wisdom against the desire of the higher entity, and not necessarily the full immediate cooperation of the man, but she wins him over. So the sky god Abashi sees that, you know, they've grown and they've gotten wiser, and now they've procreated, and there are more of them, and they're smarter and they're greater in number. And his sky wife decides, okay, I gotta calm my husband down. He's not happy about this. So she sends death and suffering and perpetual conflict to humanity. And the first earth couple dies, and their descendants have lived in suffering ever since. So this tells a tale of staged human development, of engineering by superior beings, highly developed intelligence from the sky. Familiar story. And it starts with these hybridized humans start out with they have no self-awareness, they're not sexualized beings, they need supervision and care. And all the tales say that man is eventually, I don't know the right word, gives into the woman and becomes more self-aware and intelligent, and that this growth, it's all, the impetus is the woman. And this is all in defiance of their highly intelligent creator beings, and as a punishment, especially the woman gets, you know, childbirth and pain, and then they decide, well, there's too many of them and they're hanging around too long. Their life span was too long. So they wanted to limit the number of years a human could live, and they created a mass death in a cataclysmic flood. So wipe the slate clean, make them live less long, and let's start over and see if we can get it right this next time. And then they did a fragmentation of the population. When the population finally got back together and started to reemerge as a formidable population, they built a tower, the humans did, and there are different ways of describing them in different books, but in essence, something very, very tall that communicated with the gods. And the gods didn't like that because it helped to literally elevate, but also in communication skills, therefore knowledge, humans were elevated more than the gods felt comfortable, and, you know, metaphorically getting closer to the gods. And so they created a breakdown in communication, the Tower of Babel, in other words. So in all of these tales, the creators are always against human progress, which is really contradictory if you think about a divine being creating humans and then wanting the best for them. That's not how these tales work out. In the Popul Vuh, the engineers downgrade humanity genetically to limit their progress, like take away some of their brain power. And they switched off the human ability to see beyond the limits of earthly reality. And this is similar to the Tower of Babel, which focuses less on genetics, more on actual verbal communication, and metaphorically probably interstellar type communication. And the creators in Tower of Babel, they interfere with human communication through the Stargate, is what it basically was. And they say if they're capable of this tower, nothing will be impossible for man. So doing this breakdown of communication, you break the unity of people, and he describes it as a monstrous act. And he says these are immoral acts, and that's clear that they're immoral. They involve retribution and genocide and limitation of people and a denial of free will. And it's important to remember that in these stories, although the powerful ones are plural, it's not just one god, they're all plural, it's always a group. And the Genesis stories happened long. Another thing he adds, that these stories of this group of gods, happened long before Yahweh appeared to Moses. And here's the reference I have here. According to the mainstream biblical translations, the divine punishment that's meted out upon the humans is God's retribution for the terrible crime of infringing divine zoning laws, constructing a building that's too tall, and his punishment is for the arrogance of trying to reach the heavens. Read that way, the Babel story would surely be a bizarre overreaction on the part of God. Not to mention that we have erected taller buildings in the ages since without any outpouring of divine wrath. Something is clearly off key with this picture. So what exactly is the reaching to the heavens that's described in the Babel story? And he thinks it's about technical ability that draws people closer to interaction with the sky. Communication, you know, like telecom, satellites of some sort, or, you know, like an antenna, that kind of technology. And it put us too close to their turf, literally and figuratively, and they didn't want to deal with humans on their own level. So this can be a metaphor, but it can also be taken literally, he believes. And the problem is that by denying that it's anything other than a single angry God, the Bible stories ignore potentially the true events behind it. Babel tells a tale of destruction of a society that got too technically sophisticated for the big shots in the sky. So the Earth's earthly beings are incapacitated by more advanced species, and they shut down technical advances. Some say that there was a violent neurological attack. I think in the Popul Vuh, that's exactly what it was. They genetically downgrade them to stop advances in the timeline of human history. And later on in Sumeria and in the story of Abraham, things start to get a little bit better again. But before that, there's a creation of people, the rise of people, and the gods stop it and bring them back down and start again. So emerging from the ashes of earlier sophisticated civilizations, cuneiform wasn't the original. This emerged from the ashes. It was meant to transcribe many languages, many stories from cultures way far back. So what went on before? That's we have to ask ourselves. What were the source materials? The violence of the fall, the flood, Babel, these all were anti-human, and they were all done to prevent advancement. There's much confusion and muddying ideas of God with the powerful ones who treat people like livestock. And taken from a fundamentalist point of view, you are required to ignore the anomalies, otherwise it doesn't fit their predetermined narrative. So Paul Wallis took time to compare the stories from all of these different cultures, and he came to the conclusion that the narrative is really a collective memory and a trauma. It's a story of our memories of our past and the trauma that the humans went through collectively. So why would people make up such demeaning stories about themselves? What's to be learned from that? Apparently not a lot. They don't glorify the sky people. They're considered engineers and powerful ones, and they're elites or they're gods, but they're not benevolent to a point. They're not inspirational, they're not motivating, and that's what you would hope your run-of-the-mill creator would be, right? So is there tangible evidence of a highly intelligent source interacting in human history? That's the next question that Paul Wallis challenged himself to answer. So we start chapter 8, the evidence of things, and He said as a child in 1976, he took a trip to India, and he was really blown away by the cultural, religious art and experiences that he had. He said every temple depicts vimanas, and they're in the ancient texts, and they're like flying machines, and they're in the Vedas, and they're described, if you step out of context a minute and just consider what they're describing, they're these like war machine chariot flying things that travel really fast and far and furious. And it reminds me of the story in the Bible about the flaming chariot, you know. So many messengers are encoded in the buildings of India. The actual architecture tells a story, which is also true about a lot of medieval Christian buildings. And you know, Dan Brown, the guy that wrote what was the name of that book that he wrote, you know, and the Cabal, the Crusaders, the Secrets of Joseph Arimathea, and you know, those books, there really is truth to sacred geometry, and it was encoded in, well, it was encoded in the pyramids, but it was also encoded in Christian architecture, and unbeknownst to most of us here in the West, it was heavily encoded in architecture of India. For example, there is the, I'm going to say this wrong, Mervali pillar in New Delhi, and it comes from the 4th or the 5th century, and it was made of high-grade iron, and high-grade iron that you'd be hard-pressed at the time to both make and use for construction. And even today, it's in an incredible state of preservation 1.5 millennia later. Eric von Daniken, you know, Chariots of the Gods, he mentions it, and his books are not always full of, you know, facts and evidence, but he kind of is moving on a parallel here with Paul Wallis, and hang on here. So Paul Wallis is talking about his father, and Paul Wallis really liked Chariots of the Gods as a kid. One of the books I liked, and I would tell people about it, and you know, the ridicule, it was brutal. And Paul Wallis had sort of the same experience. He said, having bounced the idea around the dinner table about this book, his father concluded, quote, I can easily believe that I'm the product of a higher intelligence, and I can well imagine that one day the highly intelligent species will return and recognize me as one of their own and take me home with them. And Paul says, well, he was joking, of course, and we all laughed, but, you know, was he? And he gave his son an enormous gift of entertaining, even being open-minded enough to even entertain the notion. Wallis remembers a hymn that he heard as a 5-year-old that people would say to him about Jesus as a little boy to get kids to behave. And he said even at the age of 5, he knew this was a manipulation tool. So when he heard about von Daniken in middle school, he embraced the idea of ET interaction. This is, you know, Paul Wallis has a remarkably open mind. Not everybody is prepared to be that willing to consider these ideas. So as an adult, he came to realization that the teachings of Jesus were different than what Christian religions teach about being a Christian. And he wanted to free people from the hierarchies. Well, he's talking about working within a patriarchal hierarchy to try to free them from the hierarchy. Good luck with that. So he said, meanwhile, all these academics were debunking von Daniken, and still to this day, you know, there's some, I can't remember now, it's been a while since I read about it. We did do one or two of his books a while back, but he was accused of some sort of scandal and I can't remember what it was. It wasn't nothing to compare to like present day House of Representatives, but still. Anyway, one of the things that they made fun of Von Daniken for was that he took the Nazca lines seriously. And for anyone who might not know, these are very, very high altitude, and I think Peru. Oh my God. And anyway, in South America, up in the Andes. And they're kind of on a high, like an altiplano, a high mesa in a very high altitude, flat, bare ground where it's so cold and so little oxygen, not very much grows, kind of like the surface of the moon almost. And yet they discovered with air flight that there were all these really interesting kind of Aboriginal designs, so huge you could only really make something of them at a distance from the sky. And they were drawn on the ground with contrasting colors of sand and dirt and rock. So academics say, yeah, these are not a big deal. This is just primitive artwork. And they made fun of Von Daniken, and he believes that ETs did them, and that they, or people with technological transportation from the ETs, that they seeded the Milky Way with DNA. Now that would be panspermia, and that is a theory of Francis Crick, who discovered the double helix with Watson and Crick. He believed in the theory of panspermia, that in some manner, either through a meteor or just out there free form, alien DNA was tossed intentionally into the cosmos, and where it landed, and if it took hold, it took hold. And that's kind of where we started out. And Von Daniken believes that that happened, and that it was done intentionally to foster life and intelligence like their own, and that whoever did it would be ready to help if they knew it had worked. So he liked to point out mythologies of sky beings that mated with human beings, created hybrids, and came out as us eventually. He really pushed that narrative. And the story in the Book of Enoch, the story in the Sumerian tablets, the Hindu scripts, the Greek legends, basically tell that same story. But Von Daniken was laughed at as this amateur, cuckoo guy. Carl Sagan, talk about your most inconsistent scientist in the whole world. Privately, early on, open-minded. As he gained in notoriety as a scientist and respect as a scientist, that shut tight in public. And privately, he was more open, and then later. But he did a lot of poo-pooing on many of these less conventional ideas that people were entertaining. Sagan called Von Daniken ridiculous. Paul Wallis thought about this for a decade, and then when he had his accident, he researched Sagan, and he calls him the ultimate scientific skeptic. So he was really, really a skeptic, and then suddenly came out with this movie Contact in 1997, in which ETs contact humans to increase their spiritual development. So that's the really the only movie he made. He also established SETI, the society for they're the ones who sent out the signal, hoping to get some answer back. In 1962, he wrote an article. This was not a book. It was like an academic thing. Direct contact among galactic civilizations by relativistic and interstellar space flight. And let's see what he said. So he co-authored this with a Ukrainian scientist. And this is the quote from Sagan. Stories like the Oannes legend and representations especially of the earliest civilizations on Earth deserve much more critical study than have been performed heretofore, with the possibility of direct contact with an extraterrestrial civilization as one of many possible alternative explanations. Boom. That's Carl Sagan, 1966. And then he started making fun of Eric von Daniken. Okay. So based on, and this is all based on the Drake equation. So what's that? I don't know. Where did I write it here? Where did I outline it? Let me find it. Pooh. Well, okay. I wrote it down. The Drake equation calculates the probability of life on other planets, takes all these factors into account, and comes up with an actual mathematical statistical probability of how likely it is. And it says it's on this page, but I don't, well, here it is right in front of me. So this may seem like a bold claim, but it's based on the Drake equation. On the basis of today's data, the Drake equation was a very conservative formula for calculating the probability of life on other planets. And Sagan, put kind of a gloss on it and then said, that quote I read you, that the legends may be actually right on. And this was from this Ukrainian guy he worked with, made this conclusion. They made the conclusion together from the myth of a Greek Babylonian priest, Oannes. And basically that writing about him was the memory of ET contact. Von Daniken quoted Sagan, but by then Sagan was debunking Von Daniken and his own past statements. And he became more and more biased towards the status quo. However, some mainstream scientists support Von Daniken and the whole panspermia idea. Oh, and I'm, outguessed myself here. Cambridge astronomer Professor Sir Fred Hoyle, Francis Crick, who won the Nobel Prize for his discovery of the double helix DNA, Leslie Orgel, a British research chemist, who with Francis Crick co-authored a paper arguing for panspermia, the theory of ET seeding. And Paul Wallis's comment is, weightier supporters you could hardly wish to find. So then Wallis saw the tops of mountains near the Nazca lines, and if you stand back and really look at them, you realize they've been sheared off at the top to create this sort of palette. And he says it's a huge geological anomaly if you look into it. And he believes that Von Daniken was right about all of the things he said about the Nazca lines, but he has gone back and admitted, well, I was wrong about this, but I could still be right about that. In 50 years since his book was written, new discoveries have added to the anomalies that we now are aware of and not cleared up any of the old ones. In 1949, there was a carving in Chiapas, Mexico, that was found under a Mayan pyramid. We're going to talk about that in the next chapter. This is the ancient alien astronaut theory, and it really is pretty remarkable. In 1949, Professor Kuhlmeister helped to discover the excavation of a pyramid in the Mayan Palenque, and he discovered under the pyramid a crypt with a stone sarcophagus, and there was the lid of this sarcophagus was a gigantic carving of a prince, Prince Pakal. And this is the greatest discovery in the history of Mesoamerica. Tons of controversy about what people are looking at. If you look at it with one eye, it's considered the prince making offerings to the gods. And if you look at it from just a slightly different angle, it looks like he's sitting in the cockpit of something getting ready to head up with air hoses and smoke coming out of the engines, and so I don't know. So this is where the whole ancient astronaut thing versus the idea that it's the king falling into a serpent's mouth and making offerings. So the authority on Mayan iconography says that, you know, sort of takes a middle ground. He says, okay, so this is the king, yes. Is he an astronaut? I don't know, but he's surrounded by the motifs that the people there used of the Milky Way, and they represent a journey into space. So there are a number of stone carvings throughout the city of Palenque, statues with something looks very much in here like a Bluetooth device, and it really does. When you look at it, you go, oh my God. So this guy's, you know, talking on his Android. So in this sarcophagus, what are we looking at in the lid of this thing? Is it depicting the Vedic Vimanas, maybe? Because it sure looks like what was described in the Vimanas. And if you look at it with a more modern eye, it looks like it's the cockpit of a space shuttle. So there are similar pieces of art, depictions in Mexican, Olmec, Aztec, Mayan, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Japan, China, the Hopi, Australia, and Guatemalan cultures, to name a few. That's not all of them. In Guatemala, there's a museum with a whole section of carved heads that look like they are in space helmets for all the world, like they're in space helmets. In the Bible, Ezekiel, from Babylonia, the 6th or 7th century BC, describes the appearance of an object in the sky, the fiery chariot, you know, drawn by angels. And he describes some sort of spaceship with a human-like occupant. And inside of it is called Yahweh's habitation. And the vehicle, he calls it the glory. I've heard guys talk about their Mustangs like that. So he talks about getting into it and going and being transported to a bunch of different places. So he thinks it's Yahweh, but would Yahweh need a noisy, smoky vehicle to get around if he was the supreme being and creator of all things? Would he need like a Mustang? No, he wouldn't. So Wallis says that we're acknowledging anomalous things more. People are more and more willing, less resistant to pointing out inconsistencies. So there are pictures of what's called Iapetus, I don't know how for sure, which is a moon of Saturn, and it looks, for all the world, like a Death Star, a mothership with millions of people that travels interstellar space, and it's so similar that even NASA remarked on how creepy similar it actually was. And in 1976, George Lucas made the movie with the Death Star, and this Death Star that he put in his movie, it was created an entire generation before Iapetus was discovered in 2005. So he made the movie in 1976, and his imagination of a Death Star is exactly like this moon of Saturn, and it had not been discovered yet. The Vedas, the Sumerian tablets, the Bible, the Mayas, they all talk about space travel. In 72, NASA engineers told von Daniken that there's no technology in the Bible, and his response was, oh yeah, read Ezekiel. This led him to draw what he had read, tried to draw a picture of the spaceships of Ezekiel in 1974. And do I have a picture? No, there's no picture in here, but there must be some important words here. In Egypt in 1995, an x-ray was applied to the mummy of an Egyptian leader known as Usermantu. His body was remarkable, save for the 23 centimeter, his body was unremarkable, save for the 23 centimeter orthopedic ring iron pin with which ancient surgeons had repaired his damaged knee. The pin was a flanged screw held in place by a kind of resin very similar to the bone cement that surgeons use today. Usermatu died around 400 BC, so clearly our ancestors were cleverer than we thought. So he says the Egyptian stone cutting often requires power tools and a diamond grade cutter because it would have to be that hard to actually cut the stone. But we're talking ancient Egypt, so okay. And in Baalbek, the temple stones that they used at Baalbek are 800 tons, and they're so closely and perfectly aligned next to each other, side by side, these 800-ton stones, that you can't even slip a piece of paper between them. A stone weighing 1,650 tons, or the weight of 4 Boeing 747s, has been found in these temple ruins at Baalbek. In Peru, the enormous stones of the pre-Inca walls of, oh, I can't even say it, I'm not even going to. Anyway, this place in Peru gave the appearance they've been softened and squeezed into one another to provide a flawless, irregular jigsaw, totally absent of cutting marks and patterned with fluid and curved joints. The modern designer Henry Kielsen believes that they used sound energy. And this is a modern, like, architect designer kind of guy. So coming from a technological bent, not a fantasist. And he believes that they had to have used sound technology. So who's they? Who did it? How did they do it? Where did the tech go? Where did the technology go for all this stuff? How come they were doing orthopedic knee repairs 400 BC, and it's only recently that they've gotten pretty good at doing those repairs now with modern surgery? What happened? That's a long time span. Harvard and a Swiss Institute of Technology have been doing experiments, and they have managed to levitate small objects with sound. Just don't tell Mike Johnson or Ted Cruz, they'll lose it. And there's always been the rumor that Tibetan monks were capable of this, and still are, or in India, they would meditate and they would levitate up off the ground. South African stone circles have been found today that generate sound energy that's higher than dogs can hear, so it's way beyond the capacity of the human ear, but also could be as loud as a freight train. And inside the circle, the temperature is higher, 50 degrees higher than outside the circle. So there's some, with the conclusion you're supposed to draw is there's some kind of energy going on here. So what's the purpose of the stone grid? They don't know what it was for, and there's more than one. These extend over South America. They're also in Zimbabwe and Botswana. It's calculated that these rocks were in place up to 300,000 years ago. Oh, who did that? Sort of flies in the face of a lot of these other stories. In 2018, the magazine New Scientist published a timeline which mapped landmark moments in human prehistory. The earliest built shelters in Japan have been dated to around 500,000 years ago. The earliest evidence of hunting with spears appears around 400,000 years ago. The oldest surviving human footprints, which are universally acknowledged as such, are found in Italy, dating at around 325,000 years ago. The first complex blades and grinding stones appear 280,000 years ago. 230,000 years ago, Neanderthals suddenly appear. Then in Ethiopia, around 195,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens have been found. Who was here in the Stone Age 200,000 years ago manipulating sound energy, and where did the technology come from? Not even getting into the debate about how old the planet Earth and people on it really are according to the Bible. They've discovered structures that argue with conventional paleontology. Paleontology says one thing, these structures prove otherwise. Anomalies get forgotten. For example, we've got tunnel and cave systems in many different places, submerged and abandoned cities that are a repeated pattern from culture to country to culture to time period to culture, all around offshore areas, off Japan, off India, off South America, and in the Mediterranean. Just Graham Hancock and his wife wrote a book about it, and it's full of pictures, and it's absolutely fascinating. And so you could believe, okay, this guy and his wife, they learned how to scuba dive so they could do this. She's an underwater photographer, and they traveled all around the world. We should do this book. And they photographed all these structures under the water, offshore, far offshore. And you could believe when they described the first ones, like, this looks like a road. These look like the foundations of buildings. The conventional explanation is, oh, it's currents. Currents do it, or the salinity of the water did it, or wave action did it, whatever. Yeah, maybe once, maybe twice. But off every single continent, all around the world, and in various places, and really different from me. I mean, it's just, I'm going to have to dig that book out. We may have to do that book. So there are similar cosmologies. There's evidence of ancient technology and timelines that agree with each other, but they're not part of the mainstream narrative. I showed you last week, I showed you this book, Forbidden Archaeology, and by Michael Cremo, 75 million pages. And I also showed you Göbekli Tepe. I hope I said that right. Göbekli Tepe. I mean, look at this. Who built this stuff? This wasn't just a bunch of slaves. Come on. And then this is about giant skeletons, and this is a person who more than likely has something endocrinological going on, or genetic. But this goes way, 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 way back to much odder skeletons and skulls that have been found. And then this is an interesting little philosophical discussion of Yahweh and his anger issues. So the mainstream narrative doesn't agree with a lot of the actual physical stuff that they found, and it's really kind of hard to argue when you've got something physical. For example, it's not in this book, but this is something that I remember, and it's from, forgive me for being so inexact, but it's either Mexico, Central America, or Latin America. But in some country south of our border, there was found like a long-necked vase, and it was made of some sort of stone. And first of all, they couldn't understand, how did they get all the way into the neck of this thing and do the bowl of it? The age they thought it would be impossible because of the hardness of the stone. And I can't remember. But basically the story is, it's so old, technology to make it didn't exist. But even more interesting, it was magnetically charged, uniformly magnetically charged. I don't remember which one was inside and which one was outside, but like inside it was positive, outside it was negative, or vice versa, I don't remember. But the fact that it was magnetically charged like that, consistently all the way around it, and that it was virtually impossible to make, even with modern tools. It would have been difficult to make because it was so hard. And they eliminated all the potentials. They didn't use acid. They didn't use water. They didn't use gentle picking at it for 7,000 years. No. They were unable to explain how it was made, but it exists. So, chapter 10, Loving the Alien. So until recently, media, NASA, astronauts were all more than happy to debunk the notion and to ridicule the notion of UFOs and ET contact. Anybody that was in a position of scientific authority, mainstream, anybody with tenure. So it was common for governments to have a designated officer to deal with this, like a PR guy who would be sent out to investigate reports and then completely debunk them and dismiss them. Or immediately they were classified and could not even be looked at. In the beginning of the 2000s, most of these offices were shut down, like Nick Pope in England. They shut him down. And former officials formed what's called the Disclosure Project. Richard Dolan, I think, is big on that. And he was a historian. He was working on his PhD on, I believe, Cold War stuff, and was keeping notes on incursions over borders in the sky, and quickly realized, well, wait a minute, what are they talking about? Saucers? What are they talking about? Our fighter pilot was shot at by something that went faster than any human being could possibly survive. And he started just logging this stuff, keeping a chronological log of it, which led to a lot of his books, and they're fabulous. If you haven't read Richard Dolan's books about UFOs, they're fascinating. So the Disclosure Project was a campaign to declassify a lot of this early information, the early reports, eyewitness reports, early cases that now really are in the public domain. And the United States is not real cooperative. They're not willing to classify much yet. But it is, you can get some stuff from the Freedom of Information Act, and they're still using the 1947 National Security Act that Truman used to create the CIA. That's still what informs their decisions about UFO information. And they classified, according to that act in 1947, all the stories about UFOs, and debunked what they couldn't, hide. Like Roswell is a perfect example. Go back and read that story. I mean, that was just a Gordian knot of deception and subterfuge. But they're getting a little better. The debunking is slowly changing. What can we believe? How much of it is intentional misinformation to distract? How much of it is real? At this point, will we ever really know? I don't know. Colonel Al Warden set up, he's from NASA, he set up new talks to try to get information out. Let's see here. Let me make sure I have his name right. Yeah, Al Warden. And he's one of the few people in NASA who actually have been willing to speak, but there are others. So just to name a few, these are the people of legitimate standing within the conventional field. Mercury astronauts, Gordon Cooper, Scott Carpenter, Donald Slayton. Apollo astronauts, Eugene Cernan, Colonel Al Warden, Colonel Buzz Aldrin, Dr. Brian O'Leary, Edgar Allan Mitchell, and Lieutenant Colonel Onizuka. And as he says, that's quite a body of credible witnesses. And there have been all kinds of dark accusations of death threats and intimidation and abuse. You hear the story of the kid whose father was Dr. I forget his name. He was working the Roswell case, and he brought a couple of bits of debris home to show his children, and the government came in and put him up against a wall with his hand around his neck and threatened to kill him, or, your family will, it's a kid he did this to. So there's been revealed cruelty, threats, intimidation of witnesses, and especially in Roswell. And Edgar Mitchell was born in Roswell. How ironic is that? And he was told a lot in confidence by witnesses at the time because he knew them. He grew up there. They were friends as kids. And he has publicly spoken out about disclosure, advocated for it, and an end to government secrecy. He thinks that we should have access to free energy and technology from ETs to save the planet. He's absolutely right. So he wanted justice for fellow citizens of Roswell from gag orders and threats. And this Roswell case especially shows how forced forgetting comes about. You know, if you're intimidated enough, you're likely to not want to speak. Let me see how I'm doing here for time and okay. I think I'm gonna stop here and start the next video. So these, you know, you can take a little break and these don't run so long. And the next video, the actual end of the book, be a little bit shorter, but we'll do card reading and drawing. So thank you very much for watching. Just remember Edgar Mitchell, that's where we were here, and his take on Roswell. And Slán go foil, Sláinte.